Hey, how's it going, friends? Thank you for tuning in to VR Revelations once again. I hope you are having a wonderful day. Today is January 13th, the year of our Lord 2023. And I have some very interesting news here. We're going to talk a little bit about the fact that Ukraine's allies have been hesitant to send their best weapons, their best military equipment, uh, because they are scared of a possible escalation in the war in Ukraine, that being an escalation to a nuclear conflict. Now, in my previous videos, I pointed out that this is in fact the only reason why the United States, England, Germany, France, and all these other countries refuse to send their best tanks, their best fighter jets, right, and their best missiles or their most advanced missiles to Ukraine, even though Ukraine has literally been begging, right, begging for these weapons since the beginning of the war. And as the Russians continue to advance, the situation continues to grow even more dire for Ukraine, and so their pleas become even more desperate. And still, its allies refuse to send these weapons. Now, we're going to read an article here from the Financial Times talking about how Germany's chancellor is reluctant to send the battle tanks, and the reason they give is exactly that they fear there will be an escalation and their country will be exposed to complete annihilation by a nuclear attack from Russia. So pretty much you'll see here, the article mentions that they want the U.S. to also commit to send their best tanks, their Abrams tanks, and that way Germany can send their tanks, and they will sort of have the backing of the United States, who itself is a nuclear power. So, Germany wants to have the assurance that in case they do send their best tanks and Russia decides to attack with nuclear weapons, then the U.S. will respond on Germany's behalf. But again, the United States itself is refusing to send its best weapons because it knows that a nuclear conflict with Russia will in fact be a mutually assured destruction. Now, before we read this article, which again, it's not only the Financial Times that is covering this, we have multiple Western media sources talking about this, and they are sort of trying to put pressure on their leaders to send more weapons, but they just don't understand the dangerous or the danger that could mean for their countries, right? Or how dangerous that would be. They just don't understand the danger of a nuclear exchange, because again, people have forgotten what happened in World War II. People have forgotten about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People have forgotten about all the nuclear tests that Russia carried out, culminating in the biggest explosion in human history when Russia dropped the biggest nuclear bomb ever, the Tsar Bomba, right? Which was enormous. The shockwave went around the earth 3 times. And then now we know, as I covered in my video on nuclear weapons, that these weapons can literally be exponentially made bigger. There's literally no limit to how big these weapons are, and so I'm sure the United States, along with Russia and the other nuclear powers, have nuclear bombs that can literally destroy an entire city, right? An entire state, rather, for that matter. And with the advancements in missile technologies, they can load multiple nuclear bombs onto these missiles, these intercontinental missiles that are pretty much unstoppable. And so essentially all this means that the nuclear superpowers have the ability to destroy the world many times over. Now, I spoke on my series of videos of signs of the end times on how I believe God allowed nuclear weapons to be discovered, to be invented, so that the prophecy of the end times could be fulfilled. Now, according to the Bible, you've probably heard of the story of Noah. There was a pre-flood civilization, those people that lived before the flood. The Bible states that they grew very wicked and that the thoughts of men were continually evil. Man only sought to do evil in his heart, and so God brought judgment into the world by destroying that civilization with water, but he promised that he would destroy the world once and for all and rid the world of corruption, of evil and sin, but the second time he would do it by fire. Now, the Apostle Peter prophesied of this in the second epistle of Peter, I believe chapter 3. He prophesied that the day would come where the elements would melt with a fervent heat, where all the elements would dissolve, right? God would purify the planet with fire. Now, you can imagine when Peter wrote this and prophesied of this by the Spirit of God, people probably wondered, well, that's just silly. How is the world going to burn up with fire? That's just not possible. Well, you fast forward to our day and age, 2023, and now we have these bombs called nuclear weapons that do exactly that, melt the elements. They literally melt the molecules around the bomb when it explodes. And so that's why I believe this is one of the signs of the end of days. And that's why, people often say, oh, people have always thought the world was going to end. Well, one big difference between our day and age and literally every other period in human history is that we now have the tools to actually bring about the fulfillment of that prophecy. And that is exactly the reason why all these countries are so hesitant to send their best weapons into Ukraine, because this will directly involve them. And then, of course, the battle is going to become almost unbearable for the Russians. If you could imagine England, the United States, Germany all sending their armies, their best weapons into Ukraine right on the border with Russia, what do you think Russia's going to do? They're going to use their best weapons, the only weapons that have the ability to overcome their enemies. But then again, the United States has those weapons also. So does England. We would have a all-out attack by these nations with their nuclear arsenal, which would literally destroy the world and fulfill God's prophecy. Now, I'm not for either nation. I'm just analyzing the situation because I believe that all of this will eventually end up in a nuclear conflict. But I do still think that there are a couple of other end-time prophecies that need to be fulfilled as it relates to a new world order, which the Bible prophesied of in the book of Revelations, when it talks about that no man will be able to buy and sell except those that take the mark of the beast. Also, there's the prophecy concerning the Antichrist, who will take over this new world system. I have talked about that in my video on the religious deception that is coming upon the world, so you can go check that out. But yeah, the big thing here is, why aren't these nations sending their best weapons? It's because they fear a nuclear war, and for good reason. I'm sure nobody in these nations wants to literally disappear from existence, right? If they're not going to be willing to risk their nations being completely destroyed over Ukraine, and this is the mistake that the Ukrainian leadership made, putting all their hope and reliance on these foreign countries to come in and rescue them. It just was not a wise move. But again, I think God is in all of this, and so it's all working to fulfill God's word. But anyways, let's take a quick look here at this article, and then we'll continue here with the commentary. So, Why Olaf Scholz is reluctant to send battle tanks to Ukraine. Germany's chancellor resists move to fear of provoking Vladimir Putin. Okay. Olaf Scholz is under growing international pressure to make a momentous decision whether or not to give the green light for German battle tanks to be sent to Ukraine. Berlin's Western allies have been turning the screws on the German leader as Kyiv pleads for more weapons, and pleading they have indeed. We saw Zelensky travel to the United States to literally beg the congressmen of their respective states, and they still aren't willing to send their best weapons. They're sending them Patriot defense missile systems, but those are defensive in nature. They're not sending their best defensive weapons. For more weapons to consolidate its gains against Russia. Again, this is some biased propaganda here. What gains exactly are they talking about? Ukraine has literally lost territory. And recapture occupied territory as the war approaches its first anniversary. Public statements by leading German ministers in recent days suggest that the government's position is shifting. Again, all these politicians and warmongers are trying to put pressure because they believe this idea that this is all about democracy and all of this hook, line, and sinker, when in reality, politically speaking, it's just a continuation of the Cold War, right? Of the United States, the American Empire versus Russia and evil communism. Public statements by leading German ministers in recent days suggest that the government's position is shifting, but Scholz, who is the ultimate decision maker, has yet to indicate a change of heart. The German chancellor wields huge influence not only because of the military and political ramifications of a decision by Europe's most populous nation and largest economy to dispatch its own tanks to Ukraine. He also has authority to approve or veto the re-export of the German-made Leopard 2 tanks that are used by 13 armies across Europe. So there are other countries that have these German-made tanks, but Germany reserves the right if those countries try and send those tanks to Ukraine, then Germany can veto that decision, right, and stop those countries from sending those tanks, even though they bought them. I'm sure they had some sort of agreement there. Yet Scholz, known for his cautious style, has for months voiced hesitancy about supplying tanks, even as the Green and Liberal partners in his three-way coalition have grown bolder in their support for doing so. Germany should not stand in the way if other countries decide to support Ukraine, regardless of whatever decision Germany makes itself, Green Economy Minister Robert Habeck said on Thursday. While Scholz last year promised a sea change in Germany's defense and security policy in response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, of his neighbor rather, that shift has appeared slow to Kyiv and its most vocal allies in Europe, including Poland and Baltic nations. Quote, "It's always a similar pattern. First they say no, then they fiercely defend their decision only to say yes in the end." End of quote. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said this week. We are still trying to understand why the German government is doing this to itself. Well, because they're trying to protect their nation. They're trying to survive. They don't want to be struck by a nuclear weapon from Russia. That's why they're hesitant to go all in for Ukraine. Senior figures in Scholz's Social Democratic Party denied that the chancellor is too hesitant. Quote, "I don't see it as a dithering," end quote. Michael Roth, head of the Bundestag Foreign Affairs Committee, told German radio on Friday. He is proceeding cautiously in a way that takes account of the fact that German society is split on the issue. There were, he said, quote, "no clear majorities," end of quote, in favor of sending tanks to Ukraine. So it seems that the German population is split on whether they should go to war with Russia. I wonder why. I wonder if something happened between them before. The German leader has repeatedly voiced concern over his country being perceived as escalating the conflict and provoking Putin. Here it is, guys, who has hinted he could resort to nuclear weapons. So, for all those of you denying that the reason that all these countries, right, the United States, Britain, and Germany are hesitant to send their best weapons is because of nuclear weapons, here you have it. Literally, that is the exact reason why they're not sending their weapons. Let me read it again. The German leader has repeatedly voiced concern over his country being perceived as escalating the conflict and provoking Putin, who has hinted he could resort to nuclear weapons. Recent polls suggest a majority of Germans are opposed to supplying Ukraine with Leopard 2 tanks. Scholz is not helped by the political baggage of his SPD, which has a long history of pacifism and a record of promoting closer ties with Russia. So now they're trying to accuse him of being pro-Russian. However, Rolf Muzinich, head of the party's parliamentary group, said on Thursday that when it came to sending battle tanks to Ukraine, there are no red lines. The German leader's position on sending weapons to Ukraine has shifted since the start of the war. Initially, he refused to send any heavy arms at all, saying his country would not go it alone. But then Berlin began to deliver armored vehicles, self-propelled howitzers, and air defense systems. Last week, he and Joe Biden, the U.S. president, announced they would deliver infantry fighting vehicles, the U.S.-made Bradley and German-made Marder, which are mostly infantry vehicles designed to fight, soldiers on the ground. They do have like anti-air capabilities, and some of them have anti-tank capabilities, missiles on them, but they're not designed for that specifically. The move came a day after French President Emmanuel Macron said France would provide AMX-10 armored vehicles, considered by some military analysts as light tanks, to Ukrainian forces. Again, this is not enough to fight, to turn the tide of war and to create a Ukrainian offensive. They need better tanks, better airplanes, and better missiles. In an apparent attempt to up the pressure on Berlin, Britain announced this week that it was working on plans to send a small number of Challenger 2 tanks to Kyiv. Poland's President Andrzej Duda also announced plans to send 14 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine's army as part of the building of an international coalition, a step that would only be possible with German approval, as we just went over. Germany sold these tanks to Poland, but according to their agreement, Germany would have to approve on the decision of Poland to send those tanks to Ukraine. And again, the Germans are hesitant because of nuclear weapons. A spokesman for Scholz said on Thursday that Berlin had not yet received a formal request to export German-made tanks. U.S. officials remain more cautious. While they have said that they are discussing the prospect of sending tanks to Ukraine, such a move does not seem imminent. I'll tell you what does seem imminent: the collapse of Ukraine. Some view German-made Leopards as a better option for Kyiv because they are lighter and easier to maintain than American-made Abrams. Yet Scholz may only be able to act on tanks if he can do so in lockstep with the Americans. So the Germans want the Americans to also commit and to send their tanks, because if Russia turns their wrath on Germany, then they also want to have the backing of the United States, who of course is also a nuclear power. So they want to be able to have that threat of nuclear weapons on Russia also. But again, the Americans aren't even willing to risk a nuclear conflict with Russia, according to, their deeds, right? According to their decision to not send their best weapons to Ukraine. But anyways, you can continue there. The article's almost over. So that is pretty much the reason, guys, why these countries aren't sending their best weapons to Ukraine. The situation is getting more and more dire by the day there. So in my personal opinion, I believe that America and all these other countries will back down when it comes, to making that decision to go all in. They just aren't going to be willing to risk an all-out nuclear war, mutually assured destruction over Ukraine. They're just taking advantage of the situation right now to inflict as much damage as they can to Russia. And really, the biggest fools here is the Ukrainian leadership for not analyzing the situation better, right? For not keeping in mind the welfare of their people as best as they could, and only seeking their own interest in trying to make themselves richer. Now, Germany, of course, has a history with Russia, so they have good reason to fear. Of course, for all of those that have looked into what happened during World War II, we know that Nazi Germany, headed by Hitler, was literally trying to conquer the world, and they were a very feared military. As a matter of fact, they were one of the most organized and efficient and powerful armies in the history. But guess where they met their end? When they tried to invade Russia, right? Now, the Russians didn't try to invade Germany. It was Hitler who thought it necessary to defeat the Russians before he turned his eyes onto the rest of Europe. Now, this attack that Nazi Germany launched was called Operation Barbarossa. So let's take a quick look here. This is from Britannica. This is a quick little history lesson. Operation Barbarossa, originally named Operation Fritz during World War II, codename for the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which was launched on June 22, 1941. The failure of German troops to defeat Soviet forces in the campaign signaled a crucial turning point in the war and literally the beginning of the end for Hitler. And guess who entered Berlin first? Guess who was the first army to enter Berlin and who literally made Hitler kill himself? The Russians. The Americans and all the countries decided that they were going to let the Russians enter in because it was so personal for them at that point. Do some history research. That's the reason why people miss all of this, because they don't actually analyze the situation. Although Adolf Hitler had congratulated himself on the German-Soviet non-aggression pact of 1939 as a matter of expediency, anti-Bolshevism had remained his most profound emotional conviction as World War II entered its second year. Following the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states and of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in June 1940, which put Soviet forces in proximity to the Romanian oil fields on which Germany depended, Hitler's long-standing interest in overthrowing the Soviet regime was heightened. He became acutely suspicious of the intentions of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. So he was paranoid about Russia. He wanted to conquer the rest of Europe, but he feared the Russians. And he began to feel that he could not afford to wait to complete the subjugation of Western Europe as he had originally planned before dealing with the Soviet Union. Hitler and his generals had originally scheduled the invasion of the USSR for mid-May 1941, but the unforeseen necessity of invading Yugoslavia and Greece in April of that year forced them to postpone the Soviet campaign to late June. The swiftness of Hitler's Balkan victories enabled him to keep this revised timetable, but the 5 weeks delay shortened the time for carrying out the invasion of the USSR, and was to prove the more serious because in 1941, now this is key right here, this has always helped Russia, I would say by divine providence, the Russian winter would arrive earlier than usual. Nevertheless, Hitler and the heads of the Oberkommando des Heeres, namely the Army Commander-in-Chief Walter von Brauchitsch and the Army General Staff Chief Franz Halder, were convinced that the Red Army could be defeated in 2 or 3 months. Just look at the arrogance that the Nazi Germans had, right, because of their successes on the battlefield. They thought they could overcome the Russians within 3 months, and that by the end of October, the Germans would have conquered the whole European part of Russia and Ukraine west of a line stretching from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan. The invasion of the Soviet Union was renamed Operation Barbarossa after the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who sought to establish German predominance in Europe. Of course, Hitler had, in his ideology, thought they were like the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. And, all countries have always looked up to the Roman Empire, to the Romans, to Rome. That's exactly why, Rome, the Catholic Church also has a part to play in the end times prophecies. Go take a look at my video, The Religious Deception Coming to the World. I talked about that extensively in there. For the campaign against the Soviet Union, the Germans allotted almost 150 divisions containing a total of about 3 million men. They went all in to try and defeat the Russians here. Among those units were 19 panzer divisions, and in total the Barbarossa force had about 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. It was in effect the largest and most powerful invasion force in human history. This is the history of the Russians, guys. The German strength was further increased by more than 30 divisions of Finnish and Romanian troops. Let's keep an eye on the Finns there and the Romanians. The Soviet Union had twice or perhaps 3 times the number of both tanks and aircraft as the Germans had, but their aircraft were mostly obsolete. The Soviet tanks were about equal to those of the Germans, however. A greater hindrance to Hitler's chances of victory was that the German intelligence service underestimated the troop reserves that Stalin could bring up from the depths of the USSR. The Germans correctly estimated that there were about 150 divisions in the western parts of the USSR and reckoned that 50 more might be produced. But the Soviets actually brought up more than 200 fresh divisions by the middle of August, making a total of 360. The consequence was that though the Germans succeeded in shattering the original Soviet armies by superior technique, right? They then found their here we go. Sorry, that moved up a little bit. They then found their path blocked by fresh ones. The effects of the miscalculations were increased because much of August was wasted while Hitler and his advisors were having long arguments as to what course they should follow after their initial victories. Kind of like right now, right? The America, NATO, all these countries, they're hesitating. They're hesitating on what they should do as the Russians continue to march forward. Another factor in the Germans' calculations was purely political. Now, this coincides with what is going on right now, guys. Though no less mistaken, they believed that within 3 to 6 months of their invasion, the Soviet regime would collapse from a lack of domestic support. So they thought the people were going to turn on Stalin. What are all these wishful thinking articles talking about how, Putin is losing support, there's going to be a coup, the army's turning on him, his people aren't going to resist much longer. I got news for all those other countries. Russia has had a long history. They are a people that has fought in many wars throughout history, and their nation goes way back, way longer than the United States, that's for sure. They are very nationalistic and very patriotic. Just look at their history. Now, let's go and go a little bit further back into history to another little-known political figure in France known as Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, another man who is considered literally one of the best tactical military generals in history, right? In military schools, they still study Napoleon's military moves and strategies. But guess where Napoleon met his end? Just like Hitler. Now, I'm not saying he was the equivalent of Hitler, but he had a great army that was having a lot of great victories in Europe. But when he decided to invade Russia, he got all the way to Moscow. Then the Russian winter came, and then the counterattack by the Russians came. He overextended, and that spelled the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Later, Russia, along with the other countries, formed a coalition, and Napoleon never recovered after that. That was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Now, we have the article here you can go look it up, Traveling Boy, and they discuss this major battle here that took place. Let's just give it a quick read here because I'm already 30 minutes into this video. What took place on one single day near a small village west of Moscow turned out to be the beginning of the end for Napoleon Bonaparte, the great military strategist from Corsica, who rose quickly through the ranks to become France's youngest general and eventually its first emperor. Through a combination of modern-day technology and a painter's artistic touch, this photojournalist, invited by Inside Vacations to document its easy pace Russia journey, is transported back in time to September 7th, 1812, as French and Russian forces collide on a massive amphitheater-like clearing near tiny Borodino. So he's pretty much, you can see these pictures, and he's talking about this great battle here that took place between the French and the Russians. So, let's go back here. Let's go a little bit further, actually. Nearly 250,000 French and Russian forces answered the call that sunny September day when the last cannon sounded and the final saber rattled. Nearly 75,000 brave souls had perished on the battlefield. Now, this is the quote I wanted to show you guys because look at what Napoleon said on his encounter with the Russians. Napoleon himself summed up the battle best. The most terrible of all my battles was the one before Moscow. The French showed themselves to be worthy of victory, but the Russians showed themselves worthy of being invincible. Now, I'm not pro-Russian, guys. I'm not pro-American. I am a Christian. The Bible tells us that all nations are corrupt. They're all corrupt. They are all under the control of Satan. That is why there is corruption amongst politicians. That is why we go to war. That is why there is suffering, because men have their own beliefs and their own ideology. None of them submit themselves to the Word of God. But of course, all these things have to take place because the Word of God prophesied that these things would be so, and they have to happen that way. And the Bible tells us that God is in control. Yes, even as Satan governs over the current world system, God is ultimately in control and is working in all of these things to carry out His will. And He also tells us that He uses nations as His tools to carry out His purpose. And I believe Russia is one of those tools. Just as in the Bible, whenever the nation of Israel disobeyed God, got away from God's word, stopped living according to God, and started living in sin and in evil, and practicing all the evil things that the other nations did, God would punish Israel. And as we read in the Bible, many times He used their enemies to bring punishment to them. Not that their enemies were righteous, but that God is able to use whomever He wills, right? So He used the Assyrians and He used the Babylonians to bring judgment to the world in those times. The Babylonians were sinful, right? They were also an evil nation, but again, God can use these nations. And I believe eventually there will be a nuclear conflict. Again, you don't have to be religious to see this. Just go look at the doomsday clock. Even the scientific community has moved it to like 2 minutes till midnight, right? Nuclear Armageddon or whatnot. There's scientific phrases out there like Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. We know nuclear weapons have been used Pretty much every weapon that man invents is invented so that it can be used later. And the world, is in fear of this nuclear conflict, and rightly so, because it will be the end of the world. But like I've been stating, I don't think that it's going to take place over Ukraine. Now, this all might sound strange to you, friends, but the truth, rather, is stranger than fiction. Anyways, that's going to be it for this video. If you made it all the way through, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. Make sure you give the video a like and make sure you subscribe for future content. Again, don't fear, friend. Don't have anxiety. Just rest assured that there is a God who created all things and that he is in control of all things, and that all you need to do is turn from darkness unto the light of God. Anyways, have a wonderful day and God bless you.